All right, everybody, welcome to the Pat Flynn Show. We have a new guest joining us today, Dr. Tomas Borgardus, and this has been a conversation I've actually been wanting to have for a while because Dr. Borgardus, you're a great generalist in many ways, not just as a philosopher, but I know you're into jujitsu and many other things as well. And generalists fascinate me, right? So but in philosophy, you're also a generalist because you've kind of like done short-term specializations and published in numerous areas. You've published on a lot of the kind of contemporary debates around the gender ideology. We're going to talk about that. You've got a recent article solving all the world's problems on epistemology, so we'll take care of that. You have a really interesting article called Undefeated Dualism, I think is the original title of it, right? And I found that very enjoyable. So welcome to the show, and if you wouldn't mind, a brief introduction.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me, Pat. And yeah, I did a little research on you and found out that the theme of this channel is that you're an aspiring generalist. And I guess I am too, although I didn't really mean to be. It was sort of just a lucky matter of circumstance. I'm happy to have a job in philosophy. It's really hard to get a job in philosophy, so I'm happy to have any job in philosophy. The place where I work is sort of they value teaching, they also value research, but it's not a research intensive sort of institution. And so like the tenure requirements were substantial, but not the sort of thing you'd find at a place like Notre Dame. And, you know, as I said, I was just happy to have any job, but as I worked at my institution for a while, I realized I think this is kind of a sweet deal because if I were at a place like Notre Dame, I think I would have a lot of pressure to stay in my lane and like just keep mining the vein that I had started mining in graduate school, because the pressure to publish in top places frequently in order to get tenure is so high, and really the only way you can do that is like stick with your very narrow area of specialization.
Right.
And so although it would be great to be at a research place like that, the place where I am now it sort of afforded me the freedom to just kind of wander around and research whatever I was interested in, which I think was really great. So as you said, I sort of started in philosophy of mind, moved to epistemology. I decided to write a paper about whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God because that was kind of in the news and I was just curious about it. So I was like, well, I think I'll do some research into that. And then the same thing happened with these gender issues around 2016 or 2017. Right. They started like coming into the popular consciousness, and that too intrigued me. And I just wanted to understand it. And again, because of the sort of job that I have, I had the freedom to do that and just look into it, do some background research, and then eventually write some papers in it. So it's been pretty fortuitous, I think.
Indeed, I think, and for all of us, because they're excellent papers. So why don't we start about this, the gender issues, because this is something that is still very much in the popular consciousness, as you put it. So you've got 2 papers out on this, correct?
Yeah, I wrote a popular level thing for Quillette about the history of gender, but 2 academic papers about gender. And then I have a third one that I'm currently working on getting published. And then I have some ideas for a 4th one. And then I don't know where things go after that. That might be it. I might be on to the next after that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you got to pivot at some point. So, all right. So this is a huge debate, right? It's something that is very politically hot and active right now. So I'm going to let you guide this conversation, Thomas, and I'll kind of chime in where I think I might have something relevant or to offer, or a question or something like that. Where should we start navigating this very messy area? Should we start maybe with a brief history of how we kind of got to where we are, and then maybe dive into your paper of the different arguments that motivate really the distinction between sex and gender? You tell me.
Yeah, I think it's good to start with a history of the word gender, because often people sort of launch into these debates and they start using the word, but as I hope to explain briefly, because of the origins of the word, it's just, I think this leads to a lot of confusion and merely verbal disputes, because people mean many different things by this word. And it's not like other areas of philosophy where you sort of start with a pre-theoretical understanding of something. Like in philosophy of mind, we kind of all know what experiences are and what consciousness is. And then we start thinking about it philosophically, but we already have like a grasp on the subject matter. Or same thing with ethics. We grow up thinking in ethical terms, and then we start thinking about it philosophically. But the word gender is not, well, these days, I guess it kind of is it's in wide currency. It's sort of used widely, but it didn't start that way. It started out as very self-consciously a technical term. It was introduced by technicians, by psychologists and psychiatrists and philosophers. And so we have to, when you see that happen, when you see like technical terms introduced, it's really important to get clear on what the words mean, what they're supposed to capture. So originally, the way this word came into the literature was, I mean, it was long used in grammar, in the study of grammar in other languages. So if you've studied like Spanish or French or German, you've heard about grammatical gender and how, often, most often we talk about nouns having gender. And in like Spanish, you have two options, feminine and masculine. In German, you have three. There's also neuter. And I guess when studying those languages, we called, like in Spanish, certain nouns masculine and certain nouns feminine because they sort of mapped onto things that we typically thought of as more associated with males and other things that we thought were typically associated with females. But the mapping is not perfect, and there's like a lot of weird exceptions. But anyway, that's why we call them feminine and masculine nouns, and the sort of genus of these two species was gender. And then what happened in the middle of the 20th century, especially with the work of a psychologist named John Money, and I think he's the first one who used the word gender role and started talking about gender in the literature. I think what he was after was he was interested in studying femininity and masculinity as it applies to humans, like the true sense of those words, not as it applies to nouns, but as it applies to humans, the sort of roles and expectations and stereotypes that we have of males and females. That's femininity and masculinity. But just as a matter of fact, we didn't have a word that was like the umbrella term for these two things, femininity and masculinity. What are these two things types of? But if you look at grammar, like we already had a word, gender, femininity and masculinity are both examples of genders of nouns. And so I guess what happened is people just decided to borrow that word from linguistics, from grammar, and apply it to humans as well. And say femininity and masculinity are both examples of gender. And so that's how it started. And often I think when people use the word gender these days, they still have that kind of sense that they're talking about femininity and masculinity, ways that females and males typically are, or maybe typically are expected to be. And that's why we talk about gender norms, the sort of expectations we have for males and females. So I think that's how it started. But then things changed in sort of surprising ways. And it's gotten a lot more controversial since then. So far, I don't think any of this is controversial. If that's what gender means, it's just sort of, we're talking about either femininity or masculinity. We're talking about norms associated with males and females. Then I think there is a sex-gender distinction because it's one thing to be male. It's another thing to act and behave in ways that males typically do or are expected to. So it's one thing to be male, it's another thing to be masculine. It's one thing to be female, it's another thing to be feminine. Yeah, there's a difference there. Everybody should accept that sex-gender distinction. Let me just stop and see if you have any questions or if you want to.
No, this is great. No, this is really fascinating. I think the history of this is I think really important. Just kind of just understanding how we got to where we are in this current debate. So I appreciate you taking the time to go through that and also say, look, there is a legitimate distinction to be made here, at least up until this point. But then things haven't stopped there, have they?
No. No. So it's sort of, it's a little bit unclear to me when the next stage happened. I think that the publication of Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, in 1949 was pretty influential in the next step. So the little thumbnail sketch of that book is to be a woman is something that is sort of, it's determined by convention, and it's sort of foisted upon females. They're sort of forced or pressured or trained to be sort of ornamental and decorative and the objects of sexual desire and so on. And females aren't born that way, but they sort of become that way through social pressure. So it's a role, it's a social role that females are pressured or forced to adopt.
Right.
That was the sort of the subject of the book. But then, I mean, the most famous line from that book that a lot of people can quote is, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And there's some interesting work showing that this is actually a callback ultimately to one of the most famous opening lines in philosophy from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said, "Man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains." And so this is a play on that sort of phrase. I actually met somebody once who had that line, that Rousseau line, tattooed across their collarbone. I was like, oh. But the most shocking thing about it was that it was in like Disney font.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right?
That's an interesting choice. But anyway, so this line from Simone de Beauvoir was, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." And of course, this is in translation. The original text was in French, but I'm pretty sure she used the French word that we would use woman for. But what's interesting is she didn't say one is not born, but rather becomes feminine, or one is not born, but rather comes to adopt femininity. But she said one is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
Yes.
So sort of the traditional understanding up until then was, femininity is one thing. Again, we've already said that's how females are expected to behave. Being female is something else. And I guess I should have mentioned this a minute ago, but the traditional way that terms like man and woman were used were just to sort of track biological sex. Not just biological sex, but also age and species. So to be a man is to be a male, but a certain kind of male. You got to be a human male. We've got these other words for non-human males, like buck and bull and so on. But if you're a human male, then you might be a man, but you got to be an adult. We've got another word for the juveniles. Those are boys.
Right.
But the word man was tracking biological sex and age and species. It wasn't tracking masculinity. And still in many people's mouths, it doesn't track masculinity. If it makes sense to you to say like, that man is not masculine or something like that, then you realize, well, there's a difference between being a man and being masculine. So that's the way these words were traditionally used. So just to sort of summarize the traditional use, being a man it's just a matter of being an adult human male. Right. And being a woman is just being an adult human female.
Yeah.
But then
and that's the common sense view.
Well, yeah, that's the view certainly reflected in the dictionary, and it's still quite common. I mean, it's common. You'd have to specify where. I think among ordinary people, at least these days, especially outside of the United States, that's the commonly held view. In other languages function in much the same way. They have a word for adult human males and a word for adult human females. Probably because this is a really salient distinction, and reproduction is an important feature of the human experience. And so, of course, we introduced words to track these categories. Right. But that's changing, and we'll get to that. And I'm trying to get to how it has changed. But this Simone de Beauvoir book, I think, was instrumental in an important shift in the use of the word woman. Because again, she said, one is not born but becomes a woman, not feminine, but a woman. And so if you take that literally, and you don't think she was just sort of riffing on Rousseau and other people in her intellectual milieu there, if you take it literally, then what she's saying is being a woman is not just a matter of being an adult human female. It's not just a matter of your biology, because it's something that you become. It's something that you're sort of pressured to be, or it's something that you're sculpted into. And so it looks like she's using the word woman not to track anything biological about a person, but rather the sort of role she has adopted, the social role that she's adopted. If she is ornamental, decorative, pressured to be object of sexual desire, etc., well, now that's what makes you a woman. I mean, I don't know if she really believed that, because there's other quotations where she just says things like, what's a woman? It's a person with a certain kind of physiology, anatomy and physiology. And there's another quote as well that is escaping me at the moment, where she just gives the sort of traditional sense of the word woman. So I don't know. I think that was kind of a transitional phase in the history of these words, man and woman, in the English language. Even Simone de Beauvoir she was sort of a transitional figure in the use of these words. All right, so I think what happened from like the 50s to, I don't know, the 80s or so, 80s or 90s, was the word woman was understood or sort of treated among especially feminist philosophers as picking out a certain kind of role, a social role, the way that like a firefighter is somebody who plays a certain role in society. If you function in a certain way, then you're a firefighter. Same thing with women. If you function in a certain way, then you're a woman. And I guess the most popular or prevalent version of this view was that social role is being subordinated along some dimension, maybe economically or politically. Maybe you're limited from holding certain offices, or you're not given the right to vote, or you're not allowed to hold property, or things like that. So if you're subordinated in some way along some social dimension, and it's because you're believed to be female, so female does still play a role in this definition, but you don't have to actually be female. You just have to be suspected of being female, observed or imagined to be female. If you're read as female and then subordinated for that reason, that's what it is to be a woman.
Right.
And then on the flip side, to be a man is to be privileged along some dimension, because you're observed or imagined to be male. And so what it became sort of orthodoxy in feminist philosophy to say there's a sex-gender distinction, but it's not the one we mentioned a little while ago between like biology and between being male and being masculine and being female and being feminine. It's not that distinction. It's rather this distinction. It's one thing to be male or female. That's your biology. That's one thing. But it's another thing to be a man or a woman. So the distinction is between those things. And what that meant was a man is not an adult human male. A woman is not an adult human female. These words, man and woman, are not defined in terms of biology. They are defined in terms of social role. It doesn't really matter what your biology is. To be a man is just to play a certain kind of role in society. To be a woman is to play a certain kind of role. Just like it doesn't matter what your biology is, you can be a firefighter regardless of your biology.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So let me pause there. And see.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, there's a lot of stuff here, but that all makes sense, right? Is that the history there is, I think, again, very important and very illuminating. But it still hasn't stopped there, right? It's still even gone even further than that at this point. So I don't know what do you want to keep kind of like telling the origin story here, or do we want to start maybe evaluating some of the motivations that were causing various philosophers to try and promote these distinctions in the first place?
Well, yeah, let me just finish the story because there's just one more step here.
Cool.
So in that little popular level article I wrote for Quillette, I tried to trace this history. I'm trying to remember what the title was. It was like a brief history of gender from sex to psychology. So
yeah, I'll link it in the show notes so people can read it after this.
I mean, it's not like I get money for clicks or anything, but I was just trying to. I think that's a useful way of understanding the history of this word gender. It started out these so-called gender words, man and woman. They started out as just being very closely tied to biology. Again, it's not just biology because we also have age and species packed into the concept, but it's age, species, and biology. So that's what man and woman used to mean. They were just tied to your biological sex. And then second stage is it is believed by feminist philosophers or proposed that man and woman either always have been used or should be used, not to pick out sort of physical biological facts or categories, but rather social roles. So we sort of moved from biology to sociology.
Right.
The final step is a move from social role, sociology, to just pure psychology, where to be a man or a woman isn't a matter of what role you play in society. It's just a matter of certain kinds of beliefs you have about yourself, or possibly certain kinds of desires, a desire to be treated in a certain way or a desire to be seen a certain way. So it's a purely psychological state that determines whether a person is a man or a woman.
Right.
So that's the last step. And it's not super clear to me when that happened, but it certainly is concomitant with the rise of trans-inclusive philosophy, a desire to cultivate a variety of feminism that would encompass or include trans women as women, and of course exclude trans men as women. They should not count as women according to trans-inclusive philosophers. And more recently, non-binary individuals should not count. None of them should count as women. So this became a kind of project among people working in this area, among philosophers working in this area. Right. And I think I need to add, I recently had a conversation about this with Cameron Bertuzzi, and I think this led to some confusion among viewers. When I say that, like, this is a common view among philosophers, or this was a project among philosophers, it might sound to viewers as though I'm part of that project, like, or I agree with that or something. But I'm just reporting. I'm reporting what other philosophers have been up to, right. And I don't mean to endorse it or anything like that. But I think when I had this conversation with Cameron, people thought I was sharing my own views or endorsing.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Good. No. Good to make that clarification. Right. Just reporting right now. That's it. Just reporting. Yeah.
And so what these philosophers noticed was even the social role view of womanhood, where to be a woman is to be subordinated on sex-marked grounds, that's not going to include all trans women. Some trans women will be excluded. Just as one example, trans women who aren't read as men, as women, trans women who aren't read as women, maybe because they're not presenting as women, or they are, but they're not taken seriously or something like that. They're not being read as women. They may not be subordinated on sex-marked grounds. And so on that sort of second view we've looked at, they wouldn't count as women. And so the most recent, like where things stand now is what's the sort of holy grail for people working on this project is to try to come up with a definition of womanhood that will map on perfectly with self-identification. So that if you identify as a woman, you're in. And if you don't identify as a woman, then you're not in the category. And so that's a purely psychological state. And it's sort of, that's what they want. It's maximally trans-inclusive, but also exclusive in the right ways, because trans men do not identify as women, and so they shouldn't be in the category. Non-binary individuals don't identify as women, and so they should not be in the category. So that's kind of what they want.
Right. It's not just a logically coherent definition, but a sufficiently expansive, but also sufficiently restrictive definition.
So that's sort of, these are the goalposts, as it were. Like this is the goal, to craft a version of feminism that respects self-identification. And a lot of philosophers working in this area are very explicit, like any theory of womanhood that doesn't respect self-identification is just out of bounds and unacceptable. Cannot be allowed to happen. So this is the goal. But then the question is, like, how do we achieve that goal? And I think at the popular level, people are sort of happy to just say, well, being a woman is to identify as a woman. And they think that that's cool, what they just said. But I think philosophers are sensitive to concerns about circularity. And if this is meant to like convey the meaning of the word woman, if you're like unsure what the word woman means and somebody says, oh, well, it's anybody who identifies as a woman, this has not succeeded in conveying the meaning of the word because the word was used in the definition itself. And so there are circularity worries. So I think philosophers are sensitive to that concern because we've been trained for a long time to avoid circularity. And so it's still very much a live debate in the ivory tower, as it were. But I think like down at the grassroots level, what you hear most often is this sort of circular definition.
So let's all right, I want to get into again evaluating the arguments like you do in your paper, because your paper essentially says there's no good arguments, right? And we should stick to the traditional definition. We'll get there. I just want to spend a few minutes on the whole self-identification thing. One is, do you think that there's any good motivations behind this in general? And two, if there are, and again, this is not an area that I've researched a lot, so I'm learning here too. But if there are, then what are the principal boundaries for that? I mean, some of the classic thoughts that come to your mind is, well, can I identify as also being 78 years old if I'm only 35? Or could I identify as being from a different country, even though I'm not, right? What would be the boundaries to this? And if there are no boundaries, that would seem problematic for many reasons. If there are boundaries, how do we establish them? So, and yeah, any initial thoughts on all that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that a really important distinction to make is between two different kinds of projects. So as you mentioned, I've written 2 academic papers in this area, and they were sort of addressed at different kinds of projects. So one was called Some Internal Problems with Revisionary Gender Concepts. I think that's what it was called. I'm forgetting the title. Some Internal Problems with Revisionary Gender Concepts. I think that was the title. I wrote it a few years ago now. And the other one was Evaluating Arguments for the Sex-Gender Distinction, or something like that.
Right.
So one project that people might have, or one view that people might have, is when I say that a woman is somebody subordinated on sex-marked grounds, or a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, I mean to be telling you what the word has always meant. It was a mistake to think that women are adult human females. That has always been false. The dictionaries got it wrong. They misreported what the word really means.
Yeah.
And so this project says, that was always a mistake. Here's the fact of the matter. Here's what the word has always meant. And so there, I think we are actually engaged in a bit of ordinary language philosophy. We're talking about a word that has words that have been in common usage for a long time. And so there, linguistic intuitions are relevant. We can reflect on our concepts and wonder, is it really true that to be a woman is to identify as a woman, or to be a woman is subordinated on sex-marked grounds? And so examples like the Queen of England, who you might think is a woman, but not very subordinated, in fact, occupies a very privileged position. Those sorts of cases are relevant. Those sorts of counterexamples are relevant to this project, because they're making a claim about what the ordinary terms mean and have always meant.
Yeah, and it's just that the dictionary got it wrong for years, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's often what we do in philosophy, in epistemology, when we think about what knowledge is. We don't mean to just come up with stipulative definitions and say, I hereby declare that knowledge is, let's keep things easy. It's just true belief. There, I solved the Gettier problem, or something like that. That's not what we're doing in epistemology. We're sort of trying to understand this concept that has been in circulation probably for the whole history of humanity, and across every language, we've got a word for knowledge. So we're trying to understand what that thing is. We do that with justice and moral terms and consciousness and so on. Okay, so that's one project that might be happening. But another project that some people are engaged in very clearly and explicitly is what has become known as conceptual engineering, which sounds pretty cool. Conceptual engineering.
Yeah, it's sweet. Mm-hmm.
In the feminist philosophy literature, another term is also kind of dominant, but I think it means the same thing: ameliorative inquiry. Ameliorative inquiry. So it's a kind of inquiry or research that is meant to ameliorate some harm, to reduce some harm, to combat some injustice or something like that. So it's ameliorative inquiry. And people working in this project are very clear that they are engineering, they're sort of fabricating, they are designing a new concept. It's not the one that is commonly used or ordinarily used. That one is captured by the dictionary definition: adult human male for man, adult human female for woman. They think those concepts are deficient in various ways and should be replaced. We should use those old words, the actual sounds and sequence of letters, use those old words to express this new concept. And the new concept might be something like having to do with self-identification or desire to be treated in a certain way or something like that.
Right.
So there, it's very much like a stipulative project. Like, I hereby declare that woman means anyone who identifies as woman, or anyone who wishes to be treated as a female or something like that. And so you can't, you can't counterexample stipulations like that, because it's just sort of a declaration of your intention to use words in certain ways. It's not even a truth claim. It's not something that can be true or false. It's just like, I hereby declare that I will use the word "oof" to mean whatever.
Right. That I hereby declare to use the word noodle to mean microphone or something like that.
Yeah.
Right?
So you can't object to that by using your linguistic intuitions about what noodle ordinarily means or what woman ordinarily means.
Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm.
All that you can, so what you have to do with that sort of project is evaluate the motivations behind it and see, like, will this policy that you're adopting, this declaration that you've made, will it help you achieve your ends? Is it the best means to your ends? So you can do that. You can sort of evaluate it at a practical level. Will this help you achieve your ends? Or you can evaluate it for any sort of internal inconsistencies. Is there any sort of logical incoherence here? Or is there something about your policy that is self-defeating or something like that? So that was the paper I wrote, Some Internal Problems with Revisionary Gender Concepts. That one was aimed at the Conceptual Engineering project. And that's why I put internal in the title, because I'm just pointing out internal problems with the project, because it's this sort of conceptual engineering project. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I wanted to make that distinction. So if your viewers enter into these sorts of conversations with people, they should be sensitive to these two possible projects and try to get clear with your interlocutor what sort of project they're engaged in or what their view of the matter is. Okay, so that's one thing. And then you also asked, like, what are the motivations behind this sort of project? Well, if we're talking about the conceptual engineering project, I think it is important to point out that the intentions are good. I think, like, it's motivated by good intentions. And the intentions are something like, trans individuals are subject to high degrees of discrimination, assault, violence, and so on. Sort of out of proportion to their numbers in the population. They're sort of targeted because, I don't know, we have this policy of policing gender norms. And with trans individuals, we've got people perceived to be or imagined to be violating the gender norms. And so they're the subject of hate and violence and so on. Okay, so that's the problem that is pointed to. And then the thought is, one way to ameliorate this problem, or something that might help reduce this problem, is changing the way we use gender terms, words like man and woman, so that trans women are called women, trans men are called men, etc. And then I guess the thought is, you see this quite explicitly in the work of trans philosopher Talia May Betcher. I think the title of the paper is something like "Evil Deceivers and Make-Believers" or something like that. And the suggestion is a major cause of violence against trans women is that they are conceptualized as deceptive or perhaps delusional or something like that. Like they call themselves women and they think of themselves as women, but if we use gender terms in the traditional way, they're not really women. And so, yeah, the thought is like this can lead to violence. If there's some sort of romantic encounter and one participant in this romantic encounter thinks the other is a woman using the traditional sense of the word woman, but then discovers, well, this is a biological male who's just presented as a woman, then that first participant in the romantic encounter will feel deceived and perhaps get very angry. And maybe the thought is, if we change the conceptual scheme that's being used by people, then this won't happen.
Right.
People won't think in these terms anymore. And so maybe that will reduce violence and hatred and discrimination and so on. So that's the intention. And again, I'm just in the business right now of reporting to you.
Yes. Yeah. No. This is. I'm really glad. This is really helpful. This is great. So yeah, keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So well, I guess that's all I wanted to say about motivation. Wait, there was one other thing. Oh yeah, another motivation is especially with the sort of recent upsurge in the non-binary category. I think another motivation for a lot of people working in this area is the thought that traditional gender norms, like boys wear blue, girls wear pink, boys be stoic, don't cry, etc., those sorts of traditional gender norms are restrictive and kind of coercive and oppressive. And those sorts of words like ring a lot of alarm bells in a lot of people's minds. People have a certain mindset who seek to reduce oppression and maximize freedom and autonomy and so on. There's a lot of people who think that freedom and autonomy are sort of the ultimate good for humans. And so if there's any sort of chains or restrictions that are constraining people, humans are born free, but everywhere they're in chains. And one of these chains is gender norms. And so some people are engaged in the project of trying to abolish gender norms, or the way they put it is abolish gender, using gender to refer to the norms there. Right. And I think that, what's sort of interesting and ironic is there's right now a kind of division between gender critical feminists, radical feminists who have long been engaged in the sort of chipping away at traditional gender norms and trying to liberate, especially women, from restrictive, coercive sort of conceptions about how women ought to be. So the gender critical feminists are one party in this debate. They are critical of gender norms. That's why they're called gender critical feminists. But they are often pitted against trans-inclusive philosophers who want to include trans women as women and so on, exclude non-binary individuals. But if I'm right, then they sort of both have the same motivation. I think even these trans-inclusive philosophers are motivated by a desire to chip away at traditional gender norms, to sort of deconstruct traditional gender norms. And so again, like that's I think what lies behind and explains this increased incidence of non-binary identification. I think the motivation that people have when they identify as non-binary, or what they're reacting to is what they perceive as restrictive, coercive, oppressive gender norms, and they don't want any part of what they call the gender binary. There's a non-binary philosopher named Robin Dembrov who's quite explicit that this is just what it means to be non-binary. If you want to oppose a restrictive, coercive, oppressive kind of gender binary that tells people how they must be, then the non-binary classification is for you. That's what Robin Dembrov says. And so again, what's sort of surprising and kind of ironic is these two parties to the debate that are so opposed on so many things have kind of the same motivation, like they want to construct or abolish traditional gender norms.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And then, okay, so there's a ton there that we could, and we'll have to unpack at least some of it. So where do we want to begin dissecting this, Dr. Borgardus?
Well, I guess we could, I don't know, we could go in reverse order and, well, I don't know, which we could do. We could start with that, just this attempt to, I could tell you a little bit about the controversy that I said philosophers working in this area are kind of sensitive to, about concerns about circularity in the definition.
Right.
Yeah, so as I said, it's...
Or yeah, if you wouldn't mind, maybe what, just because this is good, because we're gonna have people here who are philosophers who listen to this, and a lot of people who are kind of like on the everyday man on the street or woman on the street, and they're just not hip to this history, right, or to all the kind of distinctions that have been made, and so but it seems to them like there's a real difference between Pat Flynn and his wife. Right. And something needs to capture that difference. And it seems like people are starting to say that there is no difference at all on some level. Right. So I don't know if we want to. Yeah, no. You keep going to the direction you were thinking of, because you've obviously systematized your thought on this a lot more than I have. So don't let me derail it at all.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say, I think, what you just said sort of prompted in me a thought that is worth pursuing, I think. And that's this. My impression is that the sort of definition and conceptualization of what it means to be transgender has changed over the years. And what's kind of interesting is you can see this, I'm sort of reluctant to use real people as examples, but this is a public figure who is pretty vocal on these issues. So I think it's okay to mention an individual in this case. But I don't know if you're familiar with Eddie Izzard. That's a comedian, done a lot of acting and voice work for movies. So I remember watching Eddie Izzard comedy specials back in the 90s. And I mean, Eddie Izzard is still very much in the public eye these days. And it's been, I think, so I'm not offering this with any sort of evaluation. I mean to report like the actual evolution of Eddie Izzard's self-understanding. That's what I'm trying to report right now.
Right.
So back in the 90s, like in these comedy specials that I wrote, Eddie Izzard would self-describe, I'll just say this, would self-describe as a transvestite man, a cross-dresser. So he, Eddie Izzard, I'm just gonna like try to avoid using pronouns. Eddie Izzard would present as a woman, dress as a woman, but say like, well, I'm just a man who likes dressing as a woman, and I still fancy women. That's what he would say. I fancy women. I just like dressing as a woman. So, and Eddie Izzard would use the word transvestite to self-describe. So just cross-dresser. But then recently, Eddie Izzard, I think, was running for public office and said, I was one of the first people to identify as transgender. Like I was identifying as transgender back in the 90s. And I was like, well, I don't think that used. And Eddie Izzard certainly didn't use it back in the 90s. But now the way Eddie Izzard self-describes is as a woman, saying, I want to operate sort of infamously, or I don't know, this was a matter of some controversy, use the phrase, I want to operate in girl mode from now on, or something like that. So now Eddie Izzard seems to self-conceive as a woman, not as a cross-dressing man, but as a sort of properly dressing woman or something like that. Not what's the opposite of cross-dresser? I don't know. And I guess, whereas Eddie Izzard used to self-describe as heterosexual, now I guess Eddie Izzard would self-describe as homosexual, as a lesbian. Okay, so there in the lifetime of one person from the 90s to today, you've seen a kind of progression in the conceptualization of what seems to be like the same phenomenon. And what I wanted to mention in response to what you had just said was there was something in the middle there where, I don't know if Eddie Izzard ever said this out loud, but something happened in the middle where the conception of being a trans woman was something like this. It's to be male, biologically male. So biology was very much recognized, but to be a woman. So not so long ago, maybe 20 or even 15 years ago, it was totally in bounds and even sort of like orthodox to say trans women are males who are women. And that's why the word trans was used. That's why the prefix trans was used, because the thought was we've got these two spectra. You've got like you can arrange people by biological sex. You've got males over here, females over here. So this is the biological sex arrangement of people. And then there's also this gender spectrum where you've got men over here and women over here. And then, we sort of arrange people by how masculine and feminine they are. So imagine you've got these two spectra lined up. If you're on the same side of the spectra, then you're cis. Cis is just a prefix meaning the same side. If you took organic chemistry, you encountered this for like describing the position of various chemical groups on molecules. I took organic chemistry, but it was like 20 years ago. So if you're on the same side, if you're a male and a man, then you're cis. If you're a female and a woman, then you're cis. But if you're female and a man, then you're trans. And if you're a male and a woman, then you're trans. You're on the opposite sides of these spectra. Trans just means across, like transportation and translate. So that was sort of, that's how things stood. That was the way of understanding transgender identity not so long ago. But what you said made me realize that like that has changed. We were sort of observing a change in the last, 5 or 10 years or something. And there's been a noticeable shift away from that conception where biological sex is accepted. There are males and females, but that doesn't determine whether you're a man or a woman. What determines that is your self-identification plus maybe your expression or something like that. We've moved away from that, and now what's happening is even the sort of category of sex, biological sex, is disputable now. And some people are denying that these categories are real. And of course they accept that, some people have a uterus and others have a prostate, and some people have mammary glands and others don't. But what's being denied is that like there's any sort of category that humans come in like two categories, that we're sort of sexually dimorphic. That's being denied, I think, by a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's what's behind all this language recently where, it used to be that Planned Parenthood would say they're in the business of defending women's rights and a woman should have a right to an abortion, and abortion was considered a women's issue. But as you've seen in the last 5 years, now that's considered transphobic, and now it's described as like a service for people who have a uterus or something like that, or birthing people. That's another
birthing
term.
people, right?
Yeah, birthing people. And so, something that gender critical feminists are concerned about is the not just the revisionary definition of woman that's being used, but the reluctance to even talk about sex as a class, to even talk about like females as though it's a unified class. Because the gender critical feminists, maybe I should tell you a little bit about what they believe. My understanding is gender critical feminism finds its roots largely in radical feminism, and since at least the 70s, there's been this rift in the feminist movement between those who thought that what's important is to identify females as a sex class, as a class of biological sex that has been oppressed throughout history and so on, and feminism is the project of liberating the female sex, versus the sort of trans-inclusive movement that said we shouldn't understand feminism as organized around biological sex. It's organized around something else, something social or something psychological. Okay, so that's been a rift. And so the gender critical feminists think that feminism is the project of liberating the female sex. And so the reason they come into conflict with trans-inclusive philosophers is gender critical feminists do not recognize trans women as women because the gender critical feminists think to be a woman is to be, it requires being biologically female. And
Right.
so with this increasing reluctance to even use the term female, to think that that's a meaningful category, the gender critical feminists think they are losing the ability to like organize, defend, advance the interests of the biological sex class of female.
Right.
So there's a little bit more of the history and an outline of the current landscape. Alexa's talking to me, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, no, that's okay. So, all right, well, I don't know. Do we need to like go to the ground level and argue for the, I guess, for the reality of the traditional understanding of biological sex, right? Because do we need to, because I mean, that's such a deep metaphysical question, right? And I think this is important. Like, these are largely philosophical. Yes, science can help with this, right? But they're largely philosophical questions because we are talking about questions about norms, right? And one of the things that gets brought up of saying, well, there aren't just two sexes, obviously, because you have these sort of abnormalities, right? These abnormalities, that's one of the common arguments that they get brought up, these sort of chromosomal abnormalities or abnormalities with trying to distinguish between genitalia. And that's, at least on a popular level, that's one of the arguments used. And then the question, it seems to me, always becomes, well, does that show that there really aren't, two distinct kind of like biological roles in human life, and one is at least oriented towards a particular biological role that is not the same as the other biological. Whether it fulfills that is another question, right? But it's got this sort of an at the readiness, right, to develop and produce a certain type of gamete, and there's this type of gamete and there's that type of gamete, right? And then if something doesn't kind of like fit neatly into that, does that mean that there's a third category, or does that mean like that we have something like clubfoot, for example, right? Like we don't think that somebody has like that's a just different type of foot. We think actually no, something has gone wrong here, right? And then we treat it. So I guess I would say two things to throw your way. One is how do you think through this, and then two, if we do start to move away from our traditional understanding of norms, it doesn't mean we're right about all the norms, but it seems like at least for medicine, right, to get medicine off the ground, we need a commitment to at least norms or certain ranges, if you will. So. Yeah, let me just kick it back over to you on any of your thoughts on all that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I did want to say one final thing that I sort of forgot to say just a moment previously, but it's still relevant, which is like why is there this erosion of confidence in the idea that humans are sexually dimorphic and that there's a biological difference between males and females? Why is that being eroded? So I'm trying to put it in like non-tendentious terms. Why are some people's confidence in that distinction? Why is that confident? Like what's the motivation? And I think it's partly because, well, they'll give you, as we'll discuss in a second, there's sort of justifications that are offered, arguments that typically point to intersex conditions. But I think also part of the story is, it's part of that political motivation we mentioned a second ago, which was sort of this ameliorative inquiry project where we're trying to reduce social harm, combat social injustice. And I think what happened, this is kind of speculative now, but so the project was like, hey, let's re-engineer, or let's appropriate these terms man and woman to mean not anything biological, but just something psychological, so that trans women count as genuine women and trans women are men. And we're doing that to lower the odds that they will be conceptualized as evil deceivers or make-believers and subject to violence for that reason. Okay, so that happened. But then I think what probably the next step in the process was people realized this is not enough to stop the discrimination and violence and so on, because trans women are still being conceived of as males, and trans men are still being conceived of as females and being sort of discriminated against on that basis. So we need to go a step further and appropriate those sex terms as well.
Yes.
And so that's why, I mean, it was once orthodoxy to say man and woman are gender terms, male and female are sex terms.
Right.
There's an important difference between that. But that distinction has kind of been collapsed. And now you'll often hear when people talk about gender identity, or when you are given possibilities for gender identity, when somebody says, "What's your gender identity?" An answer that is accepted more and more these days is given in terms of sex terms. Like, my gender identity is male, some people would say, and they consider that a good answer to the question, what is your gender identity? Or even just, what's your gender? And then we get sex terms in response. So like 20 years ago, that would have been considered a kind of category mistake.
Right.
Like, you're giving me an answer about your biological sex, but I asked about your gender. But these days, like, it's not considered a category mistake. And increasingly, to be a female is being conceived of as a matter of psychology. If you identify as female, then you're female. If you identify as male, then you're male. And that's why we moved away from, I had mentioned that like 20 years ago, the very concept of being transgender was conceived of in terms of these two spectra, biological sex and gender. We moved away from that to a definition of a transgender identity in terms of self-identification, how you self-identify, compared to what sex you were assigned at birth. So we're using that phrase assigned because it doesn't have success implications, like you might have been misassigned sex. And whether you were misassigned sex depends on how you currently identify.
Right.
So the doctor might have like glanced at your physical characteristics and said, this is a male. But if you now identify as female, then the doctor got it wrong. That's the way it's now presented. And again, I just feel the need to repeat. Again, I am just reporting. I haven't actually shared any of my own views, however long we've been doing this.
Not yet. Yep.
Not yet. I'm just reporting the landscape and how I think things have evolved. So that's what I think is behind this move to talking about sex assigned at birth. It's part of this appropriation, not just of the terms man and woman, but also terms that were typically used to refer to biological sex, male and female. And so now even those terms are conceived of as sort of determined by your psychology.
Right.
Okay, so I wanted to say that. And again, the motivation is the same. The motivation is so that trans women aren't just bona fide women, but also female. So like across the board, no differences between trans women and cis women, aside from what sex they were assigned at birth. And that's just a matter of, you know, what the doctors happened to say when the person was born. As far as their intrinsic characteristics go, trans women and cis women are, insofar as they're women, there's no difference.
Right.
Okay, so it's not that like one is female and one is male. No, the trans women and cis women are both women and they're both female. And again, the motivation is maximum inclusion, so as to reduce discrimination, violence, etc. Okay. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then the second thing, shoot, now it escapes me. You wanted to talk about like reasons why. So that was my attempt to explain the sort of political motivation behind this move.
Right. Yep.
And when I describe it as political, I don't mean to be sort of pejorative or dismissive. I just mean like this project is motivated by wanting to accomplish certain social goals, to combat what they perceive as social injustices. Okay.
Sure.
But also, some people will offer arguments and reasons in favor of thinking that, you know, as a matter of fact, humans are not sexually dimorphic and biological sex is a sort of antiquated notion that should be eliminated. So
and you'll often hear that this is actually the science now on this too. You often hear that.
Yeah. So why do they think that? Well, I think typically you will hear, if you have this sort of conversation, people will point to intersex conditions and they'll say, look, it's kind of an argument by elimination. They say like, well, what would it mean to be female? You who believe in biological sex, what would it even mean? Do you think it's a matter of chromosomes or something like that? And then they'll point to various conditions where what happens is they'll give you a sort of category of things that they call like chromosomal sex, phenotypic sex, what are some other options? I feel I need to refresh my memory here. The sort of social role that somebody plays, but there's something else. Oh, like reproductive sex. So they'll say like, here's what it is to be chromosomally female. It's to have, in humans anyway, 2 X chromosomes. Here's what it is to be reproductively female, in humans anyway. It's to have a female reproductive system, etc. And so they'll say, which of these do you think are you referring to by the female sex? When you use the word female, what are you referring to? There's just all these options, and they don't always go together. So sometimes people will be genotypically female, but reproductively male or something like that. And they'll give you examples like this to try to undercut or debunk or problematize any proposed definition of being female.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So I guess another category is like gametically female, or female gametes are actually producing eggs or so on. Right. And so they'll give you examples like, well, somebody could be genotypically female and even like reproductively female, but not be making gametes, not be making eggs, not be making large gametes. And then I guess the argument says like, there's nothing here, there's nothing in the biology that answers to your conception of female. There's just this sort of like range of physical features, but nothing that would call for a unified category or unified class. I think the reasoning is something like that. And so, I mean, that's what explains the move to just describing people in terms of their chromosomes, or in terms of what sort of genitals they have, or what sort of reproductive system they have, or what sort of gametes they produce, but not saying that, well, because I make these gametes. Oh, I think I just cut out. Can you still hear me?
Yep. Sorry. Yeah, you broke up a little bit, but you're back now.
Yeah. So hormonally female, that's another category that I was trying to think of a second ago. So like hormone levels, they'll say like, look at this person who's chromosomally female, but has very high levels of testosterone or something like that. Right. So they say like, there's no unified class here. And so the science has revealed to us that this theoretical term female doesn't answer to anything in nature. Let's just get rid of it. And we'll just describe people in terms of what chromosomes they happen to have, what their hormone levels happen to be, whether they have a prostate or a uterus or whatever, whether they can birth children or not. But we're not going to use this category term because that's just made up. That's sort of gerrymandered. I think that's how it's often described. You're just gerrymandering these various characteristics and declaring that there's a unified class here. Okay, yeah, so I think that's the sort of reason that's often given for being skeptical about the reality of biological sex. But I guess concerns that I have about this sort of argument is, so when I've seen this argument presented, something that's a little bit suspicious is that when you get this list of possibilities, possible things that female might mean, like in terms of chromosomes or reproductive system or hormone levels or what sort of gametes are produced. When those categories are defined, I think that it's inevitable that the word female will show up in the definitions. So like, what is it to be, I mean, even in the name, and often the names are things like chromosomally female, hormonally female, reproductively female. And you're like, okay, that's just a name, but tell me what these words mean. What is it to be chromosomally female? Oh, well, it's in humans to have 2 X chromosomes. Well, why did you pick that arrangement of chromosomes? Why did you pick that arrangement? And I think the answer, as opposed to some other arrangement, why are we even talking about the X chromosome? And why do we call those sex-linked chromosomes? Why didn't you pick some other chromosomes that we had? And I think it's because this is the arrangement, this is the chromosomal structure typical of females. And so there's females sort of showing up in the definition. Hormonally female, what does it mean to be hormonally female? Oh, well, it's to have, a range of hormone levels that's typical of females, and there's females again in the definition. Same thing with the gametically female or gametically female. I'm not sure how you'd make that into an adverb or pronounce the adverb.
Yeah, I get it. No, yeah.
Yeah, so you get the idea. And so female shows up in all these definitions. It's a sort of arrangement of physical features that's typical of females. And so then I think it's worth asking, well, what does female mean in all those definitions? What's that word mean? Because this sort of argument is presented by people who are skeptical that there is any such thing as female, and yet they'll give you this list of traits or arrangements that uses the word female. So what does that word mean in all these definitions? And so I think that really these people aren't actually skeptical of biological sex. They believe in it just as well as everybody else, as well as the biologists. It's just sort of smuggled into these other definitions or hidden in the other definitions. Okay, but it's one thing to say that you haven't actually avoided believing in biological sex, but it's another thing to say what biological sex really is. If it isn't a matter of chromosomes, and it isn't a matter of what gametes you actually produce, and it isn't a matter of hormone levels, what is it? Well, I think you hinted at it in the last thing you said. I forget how you put it. You said like positioned to or apt to produce.
And at the readiness.
At the readiness, that's what it was. And I think that's the way to do it. I've heard it defined in this way. Males are members of the human species whose bodies are organized around the production of small immotile gametes, organized around.
Naturally oriented towards,
directed towards the production. And so now we're using teleological language, like there's a sort of goal or purpose of a body. It doesn't have to be the only goal or the only purpose, but it's a goal and it's a purpose. And one, it seems like human bodies come in at least two varieties. Let's just say at least two for now. Maybe there's more, but there's at least these two varieties. Some human bodies seem like they were sort of directed towards or set on the path towards the production of small immotile gametes, and others were set on the path towards small motile gametes for sperm because they move around. And I'm pretty sure it is motile and not mobile. Yeah, I'm not mispronouncing that. And other human bodies are sort of directed towards the production of large immotile gametes. They don't move. They're not. There's no means of locomotion in eggs. Okay, and it looks like this is just a sort of strategy that a whole lot of organisms adopted. Not all organisms, but a whole lot of organisms adopted this strategy of reproduction. Because it allows for more variation and more means by which the environment can select for the fittest individuals, and so the population can come to be better suited to the environment. Sexual reproduction is a strategy for doing that, for creating various kinds of variation, reshifting genetic information, reshuffling genetic information so that populations can adapt to their environment. And it seems like that's why organisms adopted this strategy. Why didn't they adopt a strategy where you need 3 kinds of gametes or 4 kinds of gametes? And then it's like, maybe some of your viewers remember Captain Planet, where like, with your powers combined, I am Captain Planet. Why didn't we come up with creatures who, like, you got to get 5 types of them together, and then with their powers combined, the baby? Well, probably because that would just be too difficult or something. It's already hard enough to just get the sperm and the eggs to meet. If you had to have like 5, it would be much harder to reproduce. Okay, so it looks like organisms settled on this strategy of having 2 sexes, being sexually dimorphic. Okay, and the definition, I think, of these biological sexes is irreducibly teleological, I think.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and some people are resistant to that because they think it's spooky. They think teleology is spooky because although we didn't use the word design, we just used words like directed towards, oriented towards, ready to produce, and so on. We didn't use the word design. Often teleology is expressed in terms of design, and then people are like, what? Design? That's impossible.
Right, yeah, but it's also another conversation, yeah.
Yeah, but they think it's like, well, this is too spooky, it's too close to a kind of supernatural worldview. But I think it's worth pointing out that there have been various kinds of naturalistic attempts to reduce teleology to something that would be acceptable to the naturalist. And I think that there's sort of no way around it. I mean, don't we all want to accept that, like, the heart is meant to pump blood, and when the heart
hard to fix a heart problem if you don't know what the heart is aiming at, right?
Yeah, it's hard to even say what a heart problem would be. Describing it as a problem sort of implies that there's a way it was supposed to be, and it's not being that way. It's malfunctioning. So it's very natural to view biology in terms of functions. It looks like all sorts of things in the biological world have functions. And that means they're sort of oriented towards or directed towards a particular kind of result. They don't always hit that result, and that's a malfunction. Or at least that can be a malfunction. So if the heart is not pumping blood properly, that's a malfunction. And so it's an awfully big cost to deny that and say there is no teleology in nature. There is no function. There's no malfunction. There's no disease. There's just various ways that things are. Some humans have hearts that pump blood so that the blood makes it to all the parts of the body. Other humans have hearts that, have various kinds of, I can't even describe it as arrhythmia because that means like out of rhythm. Whatever, there's just this wide variety of ways that humans are. None is better than any other. It's just kind of maybe you prefer to have a heart with a certain kind of rhythm than a heart with a different kind of rhythm, but it's all really the same in the end, and there's no way that humans were designed to be. It would also require just giving up the notion of health. We have a kind of notion of health.
Medicine's gone, right? Yeah.
Well, no, medicine's now just in the business of it's kind of like body modification, and it's
just all preferences of what you want. What you are thinking about. I mean, you can't get rid of it because now we at least have teleology in our mind, right?
Yeah. So I guess like humans have certain kinds of intentions or goals, and I guess people are okay with that as long as I'm the source of the meaning. Then I don't have to stay awake at night worrying about something larger than myself that has plans for my life and so on. I think a lot of people are comfortable with them being the origins of meaning and intention and goal directedness, but they don't want nature, let alone capital N nature, let alone God, getting into the picture at all. You don't want to leave the door cracked, that sort of thing. So anyway, I think that's what.
Yeah, well, I think this is. Yeah, no, this is good because it's like I said, these are deeper philosophical questions, right? Of like, okay, is there a sort of like a general disposition that we can attribute here, right? Like using Aristotelian categoricals to be more technical about it. And I think that is the right way to look at the world, right? When a dog only has 3 legs, I don't think that's normal. I think that's a malfunctioning. That's a defect. Now, I'll still love the dog, of course, right? And take care of it and call him tripod or whatever. But he's there's something missing there that should have been there. There's an abnormality, right? It doesn't make me want to say that this is just another kind of dog, right? And this is certainly a common sense view, right? But it also seems that there's going to be. And maybe we don't know, right? We don't say that like we grasp exactly what all these boundaries and norms and dispositions are, but I think we want to say we at least have a general understanding of some of them, right? And that they're there, and that there's going to be really high costs if you start to deny this, right? Across multiple areas of interest to human beings. Health, yes. Medicine turns into body modification, but I don't know, Thomas, do you think it can even like ultimately be sustained as coherent at the end of the day? Because it seems like at some point we will get back to the human mind, but there's something natural about the human mind, intellect, or say reason, that is itself, we assume, directed at truth. And if we want to say that that's not the case, there's no teleology even there, then it doesn't seem like we have any basis to say whether somebody is reasoning well or reasoning poorly. But then we don't have any basis to evaluate arguments. And then we don't have any basis to evaluate arguments either for or against all the stuff we're talking about. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good response. So I want to say two things. One is you had said, do I think this view is even sort of coherent in the end? And one thing that I wanted to say was, I think I don't know, it's a pretty low standard to come up with a view that's coherent. Philosophers sort of do it all the time, and then when confronted with sort of recalcitrant data or things that don't really fit into the view, it's easy to just bite the bullet and say, like, I accept the implications of my view or something like that. So the person who says there's no teleology or something, and the only way that one could sensibly define biological sex is in terms of teleology. I don't believe in teleology, so there's no biological sex. You can confront them with like cases of the heart and so on, and like, are you really going to say that like the hand is not for grasping and the heart is not for pumping blood? They can just, sensibly deny that and say, like, I accept the implications of my view. No, there is no goal-directedness in nature. And people have been doing this for a long time. I mean, Aristotle was aware of rival views in the Democriteans, and he was aware of Empedocles and stuff, and people were denying teleology way back in the day. And Aristotle gave pretty interesting arguments against them. So I was going to say that you had mentioned previously that like I'm kind of into, I've been training jiu-jitsu for a while. It's been like 5.5 years. And there's all sorts of interesting comparisons between these two pursuits. But here's one way in which they come apart. In jiu-jitsu, it's almost always very it's clear when you lose. If you lost consciousness, you lost. And it's clear when you've lost consciousness. Or if you tap, you lost. But in philosophy, it's rarely clear who's won and who's lost. And that's kind of a bummer, because you can have this long, protracted philosophical debate, and then both parties walk away thinking, wow, I did really well, or something like that.
Right.
And it's kind of frustrating, but you can't hope for much more than that in philosophy. You can't hope for much more than just pointing out costs of a view, making it really clear what the benefits are of each view and what the costs of each view are. And then people just sort of have to make up their own minds, and you have to learn to live with that kind of uncertainty and inconclusiveness. And so I think maybe the best we can do against people who deny teleology is just point out the costs and say, look what you have to say. But I thought you pointed out a really good cost, which was when in the study of logic and in the study of rationality, we've got this kind of what's called a partners in crime argument, where if you deny teleology when it comes to nature and maybe even ethics, what are you going to say about like rationality and reasoning? If you deny it in these other areas, shouldn't you also deny it when it comes to human reasoning? And that's an awfully serious bullet to bite. If you say, yeah, even when it comes to human reasoning, there's no right way to do it, and there's no wrong way to do it.
I like that partners in crime phrase. That's good. I'm gonna.
Yeah, I didn't come up with that, but yeah, that's what it's called in the literature. It's a kind of partners in crime argument, and it's an argument like for moral realism and ethics. Like, hey, if you're skeptical about moral realism, let me tell you about realism when it comes to epistemic norms, when it comes to norms about rationality.
Right.
You're not going to be an anti-realist about that, are you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, notice like all the arguments people give against moral realism would also apply against rationality, realism about rational norms. And so that's a kind of nice way to reason, and I like that, because then the person will be backed into a pretty tight corner, having to say like, when it comes to human reasoning, there's no right way to do it. And then I guess the response is, oh, cool, so I can go ahead and believe there is a right way to do it then. And you can't complain.
Can't argue against it. Yeah, you can't complain. Right. Yeah. I like what you're doing here, though, is like, in philosophy, like, I guess oftentimes we wish we could just lock the opponent up in an armbar, right? But occasionally you get a good knockdown, like truly knockdown philosophical argument. But you're right, they're really rare, right? You don't really get to do logical jujitsu on people as much as you do physical jujitsu, right? So what's the strategy? The strategy is, I think you're right, to kind of like raise the price tag of adopting this worldview and say, like, here's a cost, here's a cost, here's a cost, here's a cost, all for what? Versus a kind of cost benefit analysis, right? Is kind of what you're saying. And if I guess you want to argue somebody out of a view where you don't think maybe you'll be able to get a knockdown refutation, I guess the general strategy is to just make very apparent to them the costs and keep raising the price of the intellectual price tag till they're just not willing to pay it anymore. Is that right?
Yeah, although I mean, that makes me want to say one thing in response, which is if your viewers are just wondering, like, what is the most prudent way to go about philosophical disputes, especially online, it seems like there's no winning in online internet arguments. Is there any sort of strategy I might adopt that would increase the odds of, just being more persuasive? So if the question is, how can I be more persuasive? I don't think that presenting your conversation partner with a cascade of costs is going to be very persuasive, because humans just have this tendency to get very defensive and dig in their heels and say, I accept all the costs, especially if it's in public. They don't want to lose face. So I just wanted to say one thing that I feel like I've learned in my 21 years of internet debating people. I started when I guess it's more than that, because I started when I was like 17 or something. I started arguing on the internet, in message boards and stuff. The one thing I've learned is that people don't respond well when you frame the argument as very adversarial, and one of us is going to win. One of us is walking out of here a winner, and one of us is
naturally,
walking out of here
right.
Yeah, rather they seem to respond better when you sort of you try to frame it like, hey, can you explain your view to me? Let's investigate this issue together. And there's been some interesting psychological studies where if the best way to reveal to someone the shallowness of their understanding of a topic is just to ask them to explain it, to just explain their own view and just be willing to listen and genuinely want to listen. And one study that I'm thinking of, I think, asked people, do you know how a toilet works? And most humans are like, oh yeah, for sure. Like, I use toilets all the time. I've even maybe fixed one a few times. Right. And so people are really confident that they know how toilets work. But when you ask them, cool, explain it to me. Like, and not that sounded a little sarcastic or something, or a little aggressive, but just ask them genuinely, okay, can you explain to me how a toilet works? People are sort of left, at loss. They're like, where does the water come from, and how does it get sucked out of there, and so on. And then as soon as people reveal to themselves the shallowness of their understanding, then they're more open to information and maybe even changing their minds or something like that. And so again, the best way to reveal to somebody the shallowness of their understanding is just to ask them to explain their own view, and just ask genuine questions, genuinely listen. And then maybe in the course of that question, you can guide them towards what you think is the truth of the matter. And I've found that's probably the most prudent.
Well, that's great, right? Because it's one thing to just well, obviously, I think most people kind of want to figure out what's true for themselves. That's valuable, right? But if you have something that you think is good and right, then presumably you do want to help people discover that as well. So these types of practical strategies are really important to understand, and some of them are just kind of basic social skills, right? Like, you don't need they just suddenly are totally forgotten when it comes to Twitter or something like that. But always good to have those reminders. So thank you for that, Dr. Borgardus. Okay, so we've kind of, I guess, talked about on the deepest level of just biological sex. Now, do we want to kind of bring it back up a little bit? Maybe in turn to your paper, evaluating arguments for sex and gender distinction. How does that sound to you?
I'm happy to talk about that paper if you want, but just in case we run out of time, I don't know exactly how long you want to talk, and I don't really have a schedule, but I did want to say one thing. I wanted to be sure to get one thing in there that I think might be most useful to your viewers. But then, if we I mean, if you want to talk about that paper, I'm happy to do that as well. But the one thing I wanted to say was I kind of wanted to tell your viewers about the current state of philosophical thinking on this concept of gender identity. Because that is a term that is in very common usage. And I think a lot of people who have these sorts of conversations just assume that it has a well understood meaning. Although, again, if you ask them, can you tell me what it means? It's kind of like asking, can you tell me how a toilet works? And people have a hard time explaining what gender identity is in a satisfying way. And so I just wanted to say that it's recognized by philosophers that this is a very important issue that is unsettled. It's undetermined. It's not like we've come up with the answer, let's move on to something else, but it's very much a live issue. That's how I should put it. It
Sure.
is unclear, and people working on that trans inclusive project consider it like pretty important to come up with a clear, coherent, useful sense of this term gender identity, because they think like, as of now, we don't have one.
Yes.
And we really need one. Because now it's like showing up in laws, you know, and
Right,
the lawyers are hopeless at defining it. And so the movement has kind of gotten ahead of itself. Like there's already all sorts of like legal victories that are happening, and this term gender identity is showing up in laws, but it's still very unclear what the term even means.
Right.
And so I just want to say something about that, because here's what I think the problem is. So what keeps happening is when philosophers turn to this issue and think like, okay, what is gender identity? How am I going to define it? One of two things happens. Either you get a definition that is circular in a bad way, I think. So to have a female gender identity is to identify as female or something like that. To be female is to identify as female. To be a woman is to identify as woman. And then we've gone in a circle. And so that's not a very satisfying way to go about things. That is not a good way of conveying the meaning of a term. And it would be useless in laws, for example.
In a legal system, right?
In the legal system. But the other problem, I think we've kind of got a dilemma going on here for people working in this area. And what keeps happening is either you get circular definitions or you get a definition that turns out to not respect self-identification. So it excludes some. So you might get a definition proposed for what it is to be a woman, and it ends up excluding some trans women and including some trans men and maybe some non-binary people. So it doesn't draw the boundaries in the right places where the boundaries are supposed to be drawn by self-identification. And so any definition we come up with of womanhood should perfectly map onto self-identification. Everybody who identifies as a woman should be included in our definition. People who don't identify as women should be excluded. So the boundaries keep failing to line up. So just for example, I mean, that's why a lot of philosophers working in the trans-inclusive project, in this conceptual engineering project, abandoned the social role understanding of womanhood, because as we mentioned, not on sex-marked grounds. And some trans men will be subordinated on sex-marked grounds. So they would count as women on the social role definition.
Right.
And so even famous advocates of that social role definition, like Sally Haslinger at MIT, have recently abandoned that sense, or that proposed definition of womanhood. And even Judith Butler, who famously presented a sort of account of what gender is in terms of performativity, has recently, in the last few years, it has come to Judith Butler's attention that that old definition is going to exclude some trans women, include some trans men, and so on. So Judith Butler has abandoned that definition that Butler was famous for in the 90s. And it's because these definitions just keep failing to line up with self-identification. Okay, so here's something that I think is new that is in this paper that I haven't published yet, and I think it's worth saying. It seems like philosophers working in this area just keep chipping away. Like, we just need to work harder. We just haven't gotten there yet. But if we just keep working on this, we will arrive at a satisfactory definition of womanhood and manhood that draws the boundaries in all the right places, etc. We just got to work harder. But I think actually the project is like impossible, strictly speaking, impossible, not just difficult, but impossible. And that's because if you take as a constraint on your theorizing that to be a woman is to identify as a woman, and you don't want this to be circular, then there's some answer to the question, well, when someone identifies as a woman, what is she identifying as? There's got to be some account of that. So the word has to have a meaning there. When you tell me that to be a woman is to identify as a woman, they're identifying as something. There's some category picked out by that word. There's some characteristic picked out by that word. And we don't know what it is yet, but let's just suppose it's there, and call that feature feature W or something. That's what it is to be a woman, of this feature, feature W. Now, here's the problem. We've sort of been given two definitions of womanhood here. Like, I asked, what does it mean to be a woman? What is feature W? And then I'm told, well, it's identifying as having feature W. And there's just no way that that can be true for any feature you pick. It's one thing to have the feature. It's another thing to identify or self-conceptualize as having the feature.
Right.
As far as I can tell, any feature you think about, like, it's one thing for something to have that feature. It's another thing for it to think of itself as having that feature. And that's just due to the kind of contingency of human attention and human conceptualization. Maybe you have the feature but fail to notice it. Or maybe you think you have the feature but you don't really have it. That seems to be sort of built into the idea. I guess it's built into the idea of like mental states, like identifying or believing. These things can fail to be accurate.
Right.
And you can fail to form the right sort of mental state. And so I think that's sort of baked into the project, and that's why the project keeps failing, because some feature is proposed. So,
Yeah,
one final sentence and then I'll stop. Some feature is proposed, like occupying a certain social role or taking certain kind of norms to be relevant to yourself. And then what happens next is philosophers point out, like, well, surely somebody could have that feature but fail to identify as having that feature, or somebody could identify as that feature but fail to identify as a woman. And that's the kind of counterexamples we keep getting to these trans-inclusive proposals. And I don't think it's inaccurate. I don't think it's an accident. I think it's inevitable, and it will keep happening as long as the project is organized around this principle that there is a coherent definition of womanhood to be had. That's what we're trying to come up with. But it's got to track perfectly with self-identification.
Yeah. I know we said we don't get knockdown arguments that much in philosophy, but I don't know. That one's pretty good, Dr. Borgardus. That one's...
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I think I don't know. I think if this is right, and if people kind of become sensitive to it, then I guess what happens next is maybe what we'll see in a few years is this criterion of self-identification is sort of moved to the back seat and not defended so vigorously. And in fact, I've sort of started to see that happening among some philosophers working in this area. Some philosophers working in this area now are sort of making noises that seem like they might be comfortable saying that it's possible to misidentify.
Yeah.
If only for this reason. So some philosophers want it to come out that want their theory to entail that trans women have always been women, like their whole lives, right. Even when, as it might have happened, even if they identified as men earlier in their lives.
Previously, right.
But that means that, self-identification could be wrong. Because this person was identifying as a man, but the theory says this person was a woman her whole life. And so self-identification was wrong. And so if that's the case, then it turns out that it's possible that, you could be wrong about your gender. And that would be a kind of radical departure from where things currently stand, that sort of consensus view among trans-inclusive philosophers and trans activists. It'd be a pretty radical departure from the current view. But I think that's probably what's going to happen next. And I don't know, the view has been evolving and changing over the last 50 years or whatever. So I think this might be the next step.
Yeah, very fascinating prediction, and thank you so much for taking us through the history of it. And again, a lot of that was reporting, but it was excellent reporting. And again, a lot of these podcasts are just to help us understand how ideas emerge, right? And what were the motivations behind them? So that you're extremely helpful there, and I think you also were really helpful on starting to unpack and sort of evaluate a number of these ideas and claims. I would say this is probably a good pause point for if you wouldn't mind, we will have to do a part 2, because I know Jim wanted to be here. He wanted to talk with you, but he got called off to to judge a meet or something like that. So are there any final summary thoughts you'd want to say for now? And then yeah, maybe if we could schedule a part 2 at some point, that would be fantastic.
Well, this is just kind of a footnote. It's not a nice concluding thought, but it's something that just came to mind right now that might be worth mentioning, because I feel like my goal in the last hour and a half was just to help your viewers understand how we got where we are. Well, one other phenomenon that you might have noticed is a kind of proliferation of gender identities, so-called gender identities. Beyond just man, woman, non-binary, there's more. And I think that's because as gender moved from being understood in terms of biological sex to being understood in kinds of social roles, and then finally to being understood as a kind of psychological state where it's just a matter of identification. As soon as we reached that point, it's sort of inevitable or not surprising that there would be this proliferation of identities, because there's kind of no limit to how people can identify.
Right.
There's no limit to the number of identifications that people might adopt. And this isn't presented as an objection. This is just something that even trans-inclusive philosophers sort of admit and possibly even welcome. I mean, they don't necessarily consider it a problem, but they recognize that, if gender identity is a mental state, a psychological state, and it's just a matter of identifying a certain way, then yeah, there is potentially unlimited number of gender identities. So in case you're wondering why that's happening, and if there is any limit, now I hope you can see why it's happening and that there is no limit.
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
It's worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. So what I will do in the meantime is I will link both of your papers that you have out on this. We didn't even get to explanationism, so we'll have to have a part 2, because that absolutely fascinates me. But in the meantime, Dr. Borgardus, where can people keep up with you and your work? Any places that you prefer people trying and connect or follow what you're doing?
If you just Google my name, because it's kind of an unusual name, it's the first result. And then you can find my personal website that collects my papers. I post all my papers there. And I'm also on Twitter sometimes, even though I'm sort of ambivalent about whether that's a good use of time and whether it's conducive to being a virtuous person. I don't think it helps people become better people. So anyway, sometimes I'm on there though, because it's a nice way to communicate with other people sometimes. So anyway, you could follow me on Twitter if you want. Yeah, that's probably it.
Beautiful. All right. Well, gentle listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.